not ready. Someone very old with snow in his beard and a damp unlit cigarette on his lower lip came in muttering ill-temperedly, snatched Beard's bag, took it out to a sled hitched to a snowmobile and drove off. Both the waitress and Jan had disappeared, and Beard was the only person in the lobby. This was a long-forgotten experience from his school days, not only being late, but feeling ignorant and incompetent and wretched, with everyone else mysteriously in the know, as though in league against him. Fatso Beard, always last, useless at games. With that memory came added clumsiness and indecision. Although he was dressed in ski clothes of many layers, he was expected to climb inside this extra skin, even to wear his own boots inside another pair. There were inner gloves and giant outer gloves, a heavy balaclava made of carpet underlay to wear under his own, and goggles and a motorcycle helmet. He got into the suit. It must have weighed 20 pounds. Put on the dusty balaclava, squeezed his head into the helmet, put on the inner and outer gloves, and then realized that he would not be able to put on the goggles while wearing the gloves. Took off the gloves, clamped on the goggles, put on the inner and outer gloves, and then remembered that his own ski goggles and gloves, hip flask and stick of lip salve on the seat next to him would need to be stowed. He took off the inner and outer gloves, put his stuff in a pocket inside his jacket after much struggling with the zip of the outer suit, put on the inner and outer gloves again and found that in the damp, warm air of the lobby, and with his own impatient perspiring, his goggles were fogging up. Hot and tired, an unpleasant combination, he stood suddenly in exasperation, turned, and collided with a beam or a column, he couldn't see which, with a massive cracking sound. How fortunate it was that the Nobel laureate was wearing a helmet. No damage to his skull or brain, but there was now a diagonal crack across the left eyepiece of his goggles, an almost straight line that refracted and diffused the low yellow light in the lobby. To remove the helmet, balaclava and goggles and wipe the condensation from them, he had to remove all 4 gloves. And now that his hands were sweating, these items were not so easy to dislodge. Once the goggles were off, it was straightforward enough to take them to the almost cleared breakfast table and employed a crumpled paper napkin, used but not much used, to polish the lens. Perhaps it was butter, perhaps it was porridge, perhaps it was marmalade that smeared the already scratched plastic. But at least the condensation was off, and it was relatively simple after replacing the balaclava to secure the goggles around the helmet and lower it over his head and put on all 4 gloves and stand, ready at last to face the elements. His vision was much restricted by the new breakfast coating. Otherwise, he would have seen the boots earlier, lying on their sides under his chair. Off with his gloves, he was not going to lose his temper. And then after some fiddling with the laces, he decided he would see better without the goggles. Clear sight confirmed that the boots were far too small, by at least 3 sizes, and there was some relief in knowing that not all the incompetence was his own. But he was game and thought he would give it one last try. And that was how Jan, entering the lobby with a blast of icy air, found him trying to push his foot in its hiking boot into a fur-lined snowshoe. "My God, you thick or which?" The giant elk man knelt before him and with impatient tugs removed Beard's hiking boots, tied the laces together and slung the pair about Beard's neck. "Now try." His feet slid in. Jan secured the laces at speed and stood. "Come on, man, let's go." Possibly it was embarrassment that helped fog up the goggles again, but he had a pretty good idea of the direction of the door, and he had the rough outline of Jan's shoulder to guide him. "You drive a snowmobile before?" "Of course," he lied. "Good, good. I want to catch the others." "How far is it to the ship?" 115 kilometers. When they stepped out, the wind slapped his face with a stinging aftermath. The condensation in his goggles froze instantly, but for a small patch, through the marmalade veneer of which he could just make out Jan's form retreating along a path cut through the deep snow that wound between the shapes of buildings. After 10 minutes, they arrived at the edge of the settlement before a vast white plain that stretched away into a mist. It may have been an airfield, for there was an orange windsock nearby, straining in the horizontal position. Parked by a ditch were two snowmobiles, noisily pumping out a blue-black mist of their own. "I follow you," Jan said. "Minimum 50 kilometers an hour if we want to arrive before the storm. Okay?" Okay. But it was not okay. The wind was strong and they would be driving straight into it. Deep inside his helmet, the tips of his ears were already numb, and so were the tip of his nose and toes. To see, he was obliged to tilt his head and angle his sightline through a diminishing area of semi-clarity, avoiding at the same time the illuminated crack over his left eye. But all this was incidental. Blindness and pain he could live with. A more urgent problem was oppressing him, and as he turned towards his snowmobile, In his hurry and thick-headedness that morning, he had omitted all the usual routines. He had not shaved or washed, and except to drink a pint of freezing water, had not set foot inside the bathroom. Then he had hurried out of the room with his bag. Now it was -26, wind force 5, and they were pressed for time. A storm was looming. Jan was already astride his machine and gunning the engine, and Beard, trapped inside many layers of intractable clothing, needed to urinate. As best he could, he looked around him. The nearest houses were 400 meters away and showed great blank walls with 1 or 2 miniature windows. Bathroom windows, surely. Oh, to be there in a heat-tiled room, barefoot in his pajamas, taking a leisurely piss before crawling back under the duvet for 1 extra hour. But he could go right there in the ditch, turn his back to the wind, remove his gloves, grapple bare-fingered with the frozen chunky zip of his one-piece snowmobile suit, grope under his jacket to reach the shoulder buckles of his salopettes, and somehow push them down, burrow past sweater, shirt, long silk undershirt, long johns, underpants, to gain at last the moment of the release he dared not think about. No, it was too difficult. It would have to wait. And besides, he felt better as soon as he was sitting down in the saddle of his snowmobile. It was an underpowered motorbike on skids and easy enough to drive. One twist of the throttle on the right handlebar and the thing slid forward with the shriek of an overworked engine and a puff of stinking black exhaust. Within seconds, he was bouncing across the plain, following through the sight holes of his goggles the tracks left by the rest of the group, which were mercifully side-lit by the rising sun. The wind, suddenly a 60-mile-an-hour gale, cut through his layers. His nostril hairs stiffened into steel pins. His teeth, all his teeth, ached. His face felt peeled raw. By a miracle of osmosis, every breath he exhaled found its way inside his goggles and froze. And within 10 minutes, he could see nothing at all but blurry crystals and had to stop. Jan pulled alongside. Surprisingly, he was sympathetic. "This you do." He raised a flap of flimsy tin casing and wedged the goggles over the engine. They were on a tongue of land some 300 meters wide that ran between 2 lakes, or perhaps it was a bay, perhaps the sea was close by. Beard was too cold to ask. The endless snow was orange in the morning sunlight. Their track ahead lay straight towards a low mountain range many miles off, and hovering over it or behind it was a long tube of black cloud. He would have stepped away to relieve himself while they waited, but now the wind was even harsher, and perhaps his need was not really so pressing. It was incredible, he thought. No, it was criminal that the citizens of Spitsbergen should think it reasonable to go about in this climate on a kind of motorbike, when some kind of humanely enclosed vehicle with a heater, a proper windscreen, a seat with a backrest, a car, might save a life or two.